It's no secret that one of the most pervasive aspects of modern-day League is the rampant oversaturation of mobility in champions. While a number of releases don't come with any sort of quick burst movement option, you can bet folding money that the number of those who do far outweigh those who don't. Not only has it become more frequent with the new releases, but the supply and extent of mobility has also gone up substantially. In a game so heavily predicated on positioning, the ability to change your position instantaneously or near so can make all the difference between success or failure in a given scenario. Whether you dodge a critical enemy skill shot, arrive at a skirmish, or teamfight moments before your corresponding opponent does, chase down a priority target, or escape from a dangerous one, it's undeniable just how valuable mobility is, which also happens to be why it's become such a topic of contention among the player base. As more and more champions come out, the barrier to entry for those who come after becomes increasingly higher, as the champion design team is obligated to create more and more novel designs that not only distinguish a champion in question from existing ones, but also come off in a way that's more appealing to players, seeing as how the champion and their skins represent a sizable portion of revenue from this game. Lately, it appears their mantra when it comes to new champions has been more equals better, which evidently isn't always the case, as it can often lead to more problems than benefits, none more so than in the realm of mobility. Today we'll be discussing mobility creep in League of Legends, how it's gone so far out of control, and what can be done to address it. If I were to give credit where it's due, one of the main reasons behind Riot adding mobility would likely be because it makes for flashy plays when you avoid critical enemy attacks, and when most people pull off a flashy moment, they likely want to share it. Well, you can do so with our sponsor for today, Outplayed. Outplayed's a video capturing app that works for most if not all mainstream games out there, including League of Legends. You can automatically record kills, big team fights, outplays their funny moments, and turn them into highlights to upload and share whenever you want. The app comes with a built-in video editor, letting you fancy up any clips you capture to then post on Discord, YouTube, Twitter, Reddit, anywhere you feel like sharing. They work on just about any game too. You can use it for League, TFT, Valorant, or many other popular games. If you're a fan of recording clips, be sure to use my link on screen or in the description to download the app and start farming Reddit karma, Twitter likes, or Discord reactions. It's a cool app, I've used it myself a number of times, and it's always a pleasure to be sponsored by Outplayed. For now though, let's get back to the video. See, following the release of Mbessa, players immediately took notice of the absurd number of dashes in her kit, wherein she can buffer a movement command during a skill cast to then dash in a set direction. The resemblance to Callisto's martial poise was uncanny, but unlike Callista, all of Mbessa's dashes were a free target, allowing her to cast them more freely and more focused on just her position, not her proximity to her opponent. Combining both casts of Q with her W and E and then the long-range blink on her ultimate, Mbessa has a total of 5 dashes in her kit. Moving down the list, we have Aurora, who may not have dashes in a conventional sense, but the quick jump on her W, the pushback on her E, and of course the wall bouncing on her ultimate makes her quite the elusive champion for a total of upwards of half a dozen dashes. Briar has 3 dashes in her kit, her Q, W, and ultimate. Naafiri has 2, her W and D. Cassandra has 2 normal ones, his W and D, and then technically his ultimate also counts as a mobility tool. Neela has 2 dashes that she can store to use consecutively. bel'veth has 5 dashes. Sometimes I can't tell how much this bitch has, to be honest. Like I said before, beyond just the quantity of dashes, there's been a measurable increase in the capabilities of a dash, from distance to accessibility to application, some shape or form. Dashes have always been present in this game, even back to the original 40 champions. For instance, Jax's Q Leap Strike allows him to jump onto a target unit. Alistar's Headbutt charges an enemy to knock them back. Tryndamere's Spinning Slash does exactly that. Spin towards a target location and deal damage. They certainly get the job done of bringing their respective champions from point A to point B, but they come with a fairly decent cooldown, a limited range of applications, and apart from Tryndamere, a fixed uptime. Why this matters is that if a champion were to burn their key mobility spell, that would give the opposing team a window of opportunity to punish them for not having access to it, because that spell represents a huge part of their kit. For the first 5 or so years, mobility has been distributed very sparingly, if any was given at all. The few exceptions who had a high amount of it in their base kit were done so as just that, an exception, or their playstyle heavily revolved around a rushdown oriented win condition such as Katarina, and even for her there was a strict requirement in that she had to score takedowns to reset her Shunpo, which by itself doesn't really do a whole lot. This was before she could reset it with her daggers and before it applied on hit effects. For everyone else, if they had a dash, it was at most a fixed direction with a long cooldown. It was never as omnipresent in the game as it is now. The contrast between mobility of older champions and mobility of new champions is quite pronounced, mostly due to it coming off as a rule now, not the exception. Moreover, it's become further and further integrated into their base kit as a subconscious part of their playstyle, not something very pronounced. Overall traversability as a whole has expanded greatly since the early days. Gone are the days of dashing from point A to point B. You can now have multiple different applications of mobility that come in different forms. When Yasuo came out, he was met with almost unanimous backlash in light of, among other things, having a dash ability that quite literally had no cooldown, enabling him to dash as many times as the number of targets that were available. Then we had Azir with the Shurima Shuffle, essentially allowing a second dash to be input in after the first. Granted, this wasn't instated until a couple years later. The constant microsteps in Callista's Martial Poise, the network of tunnels Rek'Sai could establish around the Rift, Bard's magical journeys, Echo shenanigans with Phase Dive, and Chrono Break, mobility was growing more creative and elaborate with each new champion, pushing the needle on how much more they could do with it. Further down the road, you started to see champions who could not just dash, but reset their dashes, extend their dashes, dash in a weird way, all that stuff. More importantly, despite them becoming more and more integrated into champions, they also appear to not take up as much visible space in the champion anymore, as in they can have dashes, but that in no way would come at the expense of other aspects of their kit. For many old champions with dashes, that dash ability would be an entire spell in and of itself, as in the champion would only be able to dash and maybe get one supplementary effect along with it, usually damage or a buff or crowd control. But dashes of modern day champions now come with a bunch of additional effects, or just come in greater quantity. Take Sylas for example. Kingslayer is a dash that also comprises a huge burst of damage and a chunk of restoration and a charge of his passive. Meanwhile, you look at a similar target dash like Xin Zhao. Prior to the attack speed buff being added to it, it was merely just a dash with a tiny bit of damage and a slow. The range is of course greater, but that was the entire ability back then. You can practically assure that any champion who's in a position to carry, that is, anyone who isn't an enchanter or perhaps a mage, is bound to have some semblance of mobility in their kit. For a while, mobility was only assigned to perhaps the Diver, Vanguard, and Slayer classes, but now it feels like every class is being afforded mobility. Why though? It has everything to do with agency. Because of the importance placed on positioning in League, being able to change it gives the player a mark of agency in deciding the outcome of a fight. For most immobile champs, especially melee ones, you might find yourself at the mercy of whatever the enemy champion is or has, making it come down to a stat check, or worse, a matchup check. That's obviously no fun, so the response to that was to add mobility, as it often equalizes many things. A melee champion can use mobility to gap close on a ranged champion to level the playing field. A squishy champion can use mobility to outmaneuver an assailant, seeing as how they're unable to respond to their deadly force by face tanking it the way fighters and tanks can. In essence, the most effective way to respond to enemy pressure is to never get hit by it in the first place. There can be an attack that deals 1,000,000 damage, but if you dodge it, you're perfectly fine, right? True, but therein lies the first challenge of balancing mobility and why there can be damaging consequences for having too much of it. Like with any mechanic, it's not the mechanic itself that determines if it's good or bad, rather the surrounding context, the extent of the mechanics, the access we have to it, and crucially the options other people have to respond against it. The issue with mobility is that it's both an offensive and defensive parameter, one of the only ones in the game. Mobility can be used offensively to assure one's pressure cannot be avoided, such as a melee champion getting up close to a ranged champion, causing the latter to be unable to rely on spacing and distance to give them safety. Vice versa, mobility can be used defensively to assure one's pressure can be avoided, such as a ranged champion dashing away from a melee to give them the necessary space to avoid being taken down. Beyond that, mobility is also an essential asset on a macroscopic level, as it enables more freedom and traversability throughout Summoner's Rift, both as a means of closing and creating distance, but also as a means of getting from one place to another faster than someone else. You can have a champion with 6 items while everyone else has only 3, but if that champion doesn't make it to the fight in time, they may as well have none. Mobility allows you to respond to changes in circumstance more quickly than someone who doesn't have it, which, like I said, can make all the difference between winning or losing a fight, an objective, or the entire game. It would be no exaggeration to say that mobility is the single most powerful weapon at a champion's disposal in League. There's a reason why the vast majority of champions take Flash as one of their summoner spells. Dodging a critical enemy attack or getting in range to exert your pressure, the use cases of this one summoner spell are endless. Now imagine it being on a champion who can do this in their base kit. Riot knows this, which is why they've been adding more mobility into champions. It puts the ball in the player's court to decide the outcome of the game, which is a good thing in theory. However, when it comes to PvP games, specifically ones with a character select system, agency given to one person means agency lost in the other. It's a zero-sum game. The more capabilities you give to player 1, the less capabilities are given to player 2, because if a champion can dash to dodge an ability, that means the person who threw out that ability loses a significant chunk of their pressure. There are 3 central factors behind why there is such a thing as too much mobility. Factor 1 is the aforementioned imbalance of agency. People tend to dislike a hyper-mobile champion more than a champion with a ton of stats due to the fact that mobility accentuates all aspects of the champion. It makes them harder to kill while making it easy for them to kill you. When you see Mbessa rushing you down, constantly dashing over and over again on top of you, that feels bad to deal with, especially if you don't have mobility yourself. Likewise, any attempts you make to thwart Mbessa can become dead on arrival. Mobility allows you to get close to your target and can simultaneously dodge any skill shots or abilities that are thrown to try and stop you. On the other hand, if you see an opportunity to attack Akshan only for him to just dip on out of there, what would otherwise have been a successful takedown ends up not being so. Speaking on a macro level, knowing you can't run away from a champion nor chase after them can inadvertently discourage interaction and make the opposing player feel a loss of agency. If the enemy team has a super fed blue Kayn, there's no way in hell you can so much as walk up past the protection of your team or towers, since Kayn can traverse the entire jungle within a matter of seconds and be right there. You might be too afraid to leave your side lane for even a brief moment, since Camille can still be nearby ready to backdoor your tower the instant she gets a chance. Now you might be wondering, but what about point and click abilities? Point and clicks can be an easy way to respond to a hyper-mobile champion. Correct, but point and click abilities are an easy way to respond to anything. Point and clicks have been getting phased out of the game over time for the self-same reason people are complaining about mobility creep. You cannot avoid a point and click, making it guaranteed pressure. Guaranteed pressure consequently means no agency for the recipient, which leads to frustration. Almost everything in modern champions is a skill shot, barring a few key abilities here and there. But in doing so, they've allowed a champion to have more access to things, leading us to factor number 2. It's difficult to quantify mobility when gauging a champion's power budget. It's true that mobility is the strongest asset in the champion's kit, but mobility itself is not a threat. Rather, it's what enables something else to be a threat. All mobility does is get you from point A to point B. What that implies can be anything, but it depends on the context. It's not the same as attack damage, armor, magic resist, health, and whatnot. Mobility could be a short sidestep like bel'veth, it could be a long dash like Zeri's, it could be a free target dash like Nila's, or it could be a target dash like Samir's. Mobility is only ever seen as a component of a champion's kit, not the main focus, but people tend to zero in on the mobility aspect of a champion due to it being a roundabout way to guarantee the pressure of that champion, even if all their stuff are skill shots or avoidable attacks. Therefore, it's unclear as to just how much of one's power budget mobility takes up. Practically speaking, it's an open-ended attribute. However, because it's an open-ended attribute that's difficult to quantify, it's also difficult to mount a proper response against it, besides fighting fire with fire. Factor number 3 is that since you cannot quantify the impact of mobility the way you can other stats, it creates a very jarring experience on all sides. For a champion without mobility, champions with mobility feel very unfair to fight. Like I said, they can run away from your pressure, while you can't run away from theirs. Funnily though, mobility also cannot be used as a response to someone who doesn't operate on that wavelength. And I think Mbessa is a good example of that. I forget exactly who said it on Twitter, probably more than one, but the current state of Mbessa is that she completely shits on one half the roster with no form of counterplay available, and gets completely shit on by the other half with no form of counterplay available. Her extreme mobility makes it nigh impossible for certain champions to run away from her or land anything on her. But on the flip side, her extreme mobility means nothing against a big body like Volibear, Renekton, and Darius who just ignore her dashes, walk up to her, and beat her down with a bigger stat line. It's like a lightweight boxer trying to fight a heavyweight boxer. Doesn't matter how fast that lightweight boxer is, the heavyweight will take no damage and just needs one good punch to knock them out. By extension, that applies to most other hypermobile champs. They destroy part of the roster and get destroyed by the other part. It leads to a very polarizing experience for players on either side. This effectively means the only way for mobility to be fairly countered is if both sides have mobility. And to be fair, 1v1s between two hypermobile champs are extremely fun to play and watch. There is a reason Faker's outplay against Ryu is one of the most iconic plays in the game's history. It features two sets, a hypermobile champion, and comes down to a pure test of skill and reflexes. But when only one side has mobility, nothing about that feels fair or a test of skill. It just feels like a game of rock paper scissors where a mobile champion beats a ranged squishy who beats a stat check bruiser who beats a mobile champion. So ultimately, the reason mobility creep is not a good thing is because League does not and will not ever accommodate a landscape where mobility affords agency to the player in a way that isn't subtractive to the other players. Secondarily, mobility simply cannot interface with other stats and tools like how armor can be measured against AD or magic resist can be measured against AP. It can only be seen as a supplementary component, but champions are becoming increasingly more and more defined by their mobility despite it taking the form of a more passive aspect in their respective kits. It essentially creates a separate category of characters that have to somehow be balanced on the same rule set as everyone else. That divide's growing wider and wider with each new hypermobile champion that comes out, hence why the community is losing patience. Mobility to this extent polarizes the game and strips away agency from all sides depending on the scenario. It should only be given sparingly and with the intent to make that the focal point of their kit, not something so subconsciously ingrained in the champion. Anyway, that concludes my thoughts on mobility creep in League of Legends. What are your opinions on this topic? Do you agree or disagree with my points? You're welcome to share in the comments. As always though, if you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you left a like and subscribed. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my video on damage creep if you haven't yet. But till next time, thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.